sitting U.S. President Donald Trump is personally undertaking a flurry of diplomatic moves to try to find a path to ending Russia's war in Ukraine. After hosting Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska and also the European leaders and plus the president of Ukraine. Now, recently, President Trump believed it is time to really put stronger actions behind the words. Credibility is the hardest part. It's hard to imagine that President Trump agreeing to put American boots on the ground. Will Ukrainians believe that European peacemakers in Ukraine are a tripwire for U.S. involvement? And also, better question we need to ask, how long will it take the Europeans to stand up a force capable of deterring Russia without American backstop? And most importantly, is there going to be a trilateral meeting among Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and President Zelenskyy? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. He is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and USSR, and on nationalism, revolution, empires, and theory. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks so much for having me, Will. And thanks to your audience for listening.
Well, absolutely, Dr. Motyl. Again, right now, it's not the first time that you and I, we had a conversation about the war in Ukraine. But what happened last week and over the weekend, and including this past 24 hours, I want to read a statement to you, now not from Putin, not from President Trump, but from the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko. He recently commented regarding the summit between Putin and Trump. This is what he said, and I quote, "Both Europe and Ukraine are done for if Russia makes a deal with the United States." Lukashenko also believed that Moscow and Washington would hold Europe's fate in their hands during any talks to end the Ukraine conflict. Dr. Motyl, let's revisit the statement from Lukashenko. What do you make of that? We understand that Lukashenko is a strong partner and ally of Putin. So by believing that Moscow and United States can actually make a greater effort to end the war, how much do we believe the credibility of the words from Lukashenko? Your thoughts?
Well, keep in mind that Lukashenko is essentially Putin's puppet. And he's unlikely to say anything that Putin would disagree with. And what he said in that particular statement was, again, the key words are Europe and Ukraine are done for. And he has a point. If the United States allies itself unconditionally with Russia, and we'll talk about the likelihood of that in a minute, I guess, but if that were to be the case, then yes, that would demote Ukraine to a third rank, probably transform it into a colony of Russia, and it would make Europe pretty much irrelevant to everything else going on. So the question isn't, would that happen? Because one could just as easily say, what if the United States and China were to form a condominium? Wouldn't that affect North Korea and Russia? Well, yes, it would, but how likely is this imagined scenario? And at this point in time, it doesn't seem, again, I can see where Lukashenko is coming from, because just after the conclusion of the summit on Sunday, Putin and especially Trump started making all sorts of statements about swapping territories, about security guarantees, but especially this thing about swapping territories seemed to suggest that Trump had bought into Putin's line and had adopted his position hook, line. After the summit yesterday, it's not quite, after the meeting with the Europeans and Zelenskyy yesterday, it's be quite serious about security guarantees for Ukraine. He still thinks that the question of swapping territories, so-called swapping territories, is on the agenda, but he expects Ukraine and Putin to resolve that issue in a face-to-face meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin, or perhaps in a tripartite meeting. So Lukashenko's triumphalism is perhaps a bit premature. The fact that Trump has bought into Putin's line about a so-called territorial swap is worrisome, because Putin isn't proposing a swap. A swap is when I give you something in exchange for your giving me something. Essentially, what Putin is saying is, if Ukraine gives him territory in the Donbass that it controls and Russia does not, then Putin will stop attacking other parts of Ukraine. That's not a swap. That's called gangster extortionism. In other words, essentially Putin is saying, if you don't give me the keys to your house, I'll burn it down. There's no swap in any of that. There's no trade. There's no compromise. It's essentially, as I said, a kind of a form of gangsterism and a form of extortion. So we'll see what develops in the next 2 weeks. So that's the worrisome part of the news. But the good part of the news, as I've already suggested, is that the Europeans and probably Trump seem to be very, very serious about providing Ukraine with genuine security guarantees. That's absolutely indispensable for any kind of peaceful outcome, or for that matter, even for a ceasefire. And of course, security guarantees means that Russia must be deterred from attacking again. It's not enough for Putin simply to promise that he'll behave and for Russia to sign some kind of document. Because as far as Russia is concerned, and as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, documents are simply pieces of paper. And Ukraine has already learned from bitter experience with the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which it gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances. That security assurances are meaningless if they remain simply on paper. So there has to be some kind of presence. There has to be some kind of commitment that goes beyond simply saying, oh yeah, don't worry about it. We'll help you if and when the Russians attack. It has to be more concrete. Now, what that is and what that's going to be, well, that'll be worked out in detail in working groups involving the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. So we'll see. But as you suggested, we are in a historic moment on which the future of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the United States, as well as Asia, depends. How things develop will have serious consequences for everybody concerned.
Well, Dr. Motyl, as you mentioned, this past Monday, President Zelenskyy and also several important European leaders paid a short visit to the White House. Now, there are two leaders stood out particular. Now, the first one is the President of Finland. Let's start from there. Professor Motyl, from your perspective, why was it important for President of Finland to join this important meeting along with other European leaders? And also, we know that Finland was also very, very strategically careful about sharing comments or making effort when we look at the war in Ukraine. So by sitting at the same table with President Trump, with other European leaders, with President Zelenskyy, what message did that send to the world? And also, why was that important for Finland to get a seat at the table? Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it makes a lot of sense if one considers Finland's history in the 20th century. The Soviet Union attacked Finland in 1940 in the so-called Winter War. It wasn't really successful in the sense that it was incapable of conquering Finland because the Finns put up a strong fight. But the Soviets did acquire a piece of Finland. The Finns also were so-called Finlandized for much of the Cold War period, which is to say their foreign policy was subordinate to the policy requirements of Russia. And again, in a manner of speaking, part of what what Putin wants from Ukraine is, at the very least, its Finlandization, its subordination to Russia in terms of foreign policy. I think in terms of Ukraine, he wants it to be either destroyed or transformed into a colony. But at a minimum, he wants it to be Finlandized. So by inviting Finland, or by having Finland participate in these conversations that took place yesterday, the Europeans were signaling to the Russians that they know what game they're playing, and that they know historically that they've acted as an imperialist power vis-a-vis Finland, and of course by implication that they're acting as an imperialist power vis-a-vis Ukraine. It's also significant that Finland, after so many years of being Finlandized, did become independent, fully independent. It's one of the most democratic countries in the world today. And not only that, in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Finland, together with Sweden, joined NATO, which is again another signal to Putin that if pressed, we may indeed decide to invite Ukraine to join NATO as well. Now, whether that'll happen or whether that's simply a rhetorical threat, it's hard to say, but it's clearly at least a rhetorical threat. So it made a lot of sense.
Dr. Motyl, another leader, in addition to the president of Finland, who is the French president Emmanuel Macron, on social media, this is what he posted right after the meeting, and I want to read a portion of a post to you and want to get your reaction. This is what he wrote, and I quote, "In Washington, alongside President Zelenskyy and with our partners, we reaffirmed to President Trump our determination to continue uniting our effort for a solid and lasting peace, one that safeguards Ukraine's interest and Europe's security," end quote. Now, Dr. Motyl, throughout the entire conversation, at the table, we've been talking about what we called a security guarantee. But rumor has it that despite the visit from Vladimir Putin and despite the visit from the European leaders and also President Zelenskyy, to reach a security guarantee is still, I guess, a bit more difficult at this moment. So, Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, how do we understand the word security guarantee at this moment? And also how feasible it is today when we look at the post-Putin-Trump summit, and also especially after the meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy, the European leaders and Trump. Is it still going to happen, or right now is still a long shot when we look at the security guarantee at the table? Your thoughts?
Well, for starters, keep in mind that until recently, the notion of Western security guarantees for Ukraine was barely discussed. And there was very little discussion on the part of the United States and the part of the Trump administration, or even for that matter, the Biden administration. This notion was pretty much rejected, or at least tabled in such a way that it seemed to be irrelevant. So the fact that it's being discussed openly, the fact that yesterday's meeting was largely devoted to security guarantees, is already of some importance. Now, at this point, of course, as you say, it's largely just talk. And the question is, how do you transform talk into practice? But remember, half a year ago, there wasn't even much talk. And, the road to a policy always has to go through the stage of being talked about and alternatives being considered, and then finally policies are or are not appropriately adopted. So this is important. But your question is even more important, namely, what would security guarantees look like? They can simply consist of a statement on paper that the Europeans and the Americans will, in case of a Russian attack, provide assistance to Ukraine. That has to be part of the deal, but the deal has to involve specific items, specific steps. So for starters, before even getting into the question of what the Europeans can do and what the Americans can do within Ukraine, the fact that Europe and America have agreed that Europe will be buying American weapons and then providing them to Ukraine is extremely important. Basically, what that means is that Europe and America are providing what is ultimately the only security guarantee that matters for Ukraine, and that is its own ability to defend itself. Because ultimately, when you think about it, it's all very nice and good for France or the United States or even Finland to say, we'll support you guys, but can you really count on their coming in and supporting you? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. So ultimately, Ukraine needs to have the capacity to defend itself, to deter Russia, to make it far too expensive and painful for Russia to consider another invasion. So the decision by the Europeans and the Americans to provide arms to Ukraine is extremely important. And in as much as the Europeans would be buying arms, the Americans would be more than happy to provide them because they're benefiting from this. So it's a win-win-win for all three sides. At the same time, both the Europeans and the Americans, especially the Europeans, have committed to expanding and enhancing Ukraine's own military-industrial complex. At this point in time, Ukraine produces something like 40% of all its weapons. It's continued developing new forms of drones, new forms of missiles. Indeed, part of the deal with the United States is that Ukraine would be selling drones to America. That too is a significant form of a security guarantee, even though it doesn't talk about the response of America to a potential Russian attack. It does signal that America is going to establish significant political and military-industrial linkages with Ukraine. So the Europeans are determined to build up Ukraine's capacity to produce its own weapons. And if Ukraine can get that from 40% to 50, 60, 75, with the Europeans providing the Europeans and the Americans providing the remaining 25, 30, then Ukraine is in a very good position to be able to deter Russia from a potential attack. But then there's the question of what the Europeans and the Americans would do beyond that. Now, Trump has spoken of significant support. He would provide support to the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans would have to presumably provide boots on the ground. And that too would be significant. At this point in time, they're not quite in the position to be able to do that, but they could easily get to that point by exerting themselves appropriately. Now, we're not talking about millions of soldiers or even hundreds of thousands. It would suffice for 10 or 15,000 soldiers to be placed in Ukraine to serve as a kind of tripwire and to serve as part of the deterrent against Russia. The United States doesn't have to be part of that. The Americans can play a critical role by providing Ukraine with intelligence, information regarding, acquired by means of radars and its technology. That would be critically important. The Europeans aren't quite in the position to do that. So that would be a significant and a very useful division of labor. But the bottom line is this: whatever the security guarantees are, they have to be concrete. They have to be specific. Even if one is talking about a response, it has to be something along the lines of, if a Russian soldier crosses Ukraine's frontiers, or if a division of Russian soldiers crosses Ukraine frontiers in an aggressive move, then the Europeans and the Americans will, not just might or might consider, but will provide Ukraine with the necessary equipment, with the necessary artillery, and and possibly even soldiers to fight against the Russians. It has to be something along those lines. Now, what exactly is up to to the various sides to determine. But it has to be very, very specific. If A happens, B will happen. If C happens, D will happen. It cannot simply be this vague sense of, well, don't worry about it, we'll take care of you if there's a catastrophe on your doorstep.
Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, at the beginning, when we talk about, according to President Trump, there might be a significant trilateral meeting among President Trump and President Zelenskyy and also President Putin. Again, the goal is simply to end the war in Ukraine. But meanwhile, we have to talk about China. We have to bring China into our conversation despite everything that we saw so far. So from your perspective, again, official statement came out of the Chinese government, and I may paraphrase it, that to believe that dialogue has always been the most central and effective way to end any conflict, end quote. So Professor Motyl, from your perspective, how important it is for China to pay attention to what's going on at this moment, or especially the follow-up between Putin and Trump and also Zelenskyy, and also with the relationship with other European leaders. And what lesson do you think the Chinese government is learning at this moment? Because we know that Russia and Ukraine are both equally important from this economic standpoint and also from this trade relationship. So I want to know what is your take on the Chinese side, and how and what kind of lessons do you think that they're observing at this moment? Your final thoughts.
Well, let me just start first by talking about the tripartite meeting that Trump is proposing. I'll be very brief. It's creating, I mean, it's a genius move in the sense that it puts Putin into a difficult spot. He has repeatedly, explicitly said that he does not consider Zelenskyy to be a legitimate president. And thereby, according to Putin, he will not sign any document with Zelenskyy because Zelenskyy is supposedly illegitimate. Now, Zelenskyy is perfectly legitimate. The fact that there haven't been elections in Ukraine is permissible according to the Ukrainian constitution. And of course, as we all know, the last few elections in which Putin has triumphed have all been unfair and unfree. So technically, the truly illegitimate president is Putin. But the problem for Putin is that Trump wants him to meet with Zelenskyy, either one-on-one or all three of them. And how does Putin respond to that? If he says yes, then he's tacitly agreeing to Zelensky's being legitimate, and thereby contradicting everything he's been saying for the last several years. If he says no, he potentially annoys and aggravates his relationship with Trump. So we'll see what he says. Now, that all of that is premised on on Putin's presumably wanting peace. As you know from our past conversations, I don't think that's the case. That's why he insists on a peace and not a ceasefire. A ceasefire would end the killing immediately, which is presumably what everybody wants, while Putin knows that a peace and peaceful and the negotiations that could lead to an ultimate peace are going to last for weeks, months, possibly years. So a solution that aims at an immediate peace, which is unrealistic, ultimately gives him the time and the space and the opportunity to continue killing Ukrainians, which is what he wants to do. Now, as to China, the statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is striking for being absolutely meaningless. For China, arguably America's equal as a superpower, to say something like, well, this conflict, like all conflicts, have to be resolved peacefully, and we always support peace. Well, yeah, and Trump supports peace, and Adolf Hitler supports peace. I mean, who doesn't support peace? Everybody supports peace. I mean, so it's a statement basically saying that we're very nice people and we'd like a very nice conclusion to this terrible, terrible war. But what's striking about it is, of course, that there is no specifics to it. We've already talked about the specifics regarding so-called security guarantees. But it would be if China wanted Russia to end the war, it could easily pressure Putin to do so. Because Putin at this point in time is highly dependent on the Chinese for political support, technological support, and of course, economic support. He needs the Chinese market. He needs Chinese friendship. And if China wanted a serious conclusion to this terrible conflict, then all it has to do is to tell Putin to end the war, or else. But it hasn't done that. So the question is, why is it still wishy-washy? Why is it still refraining from adopting a serious position regarding the war? And I think part of the answer is that it doesn't know how to end the war. That's partly the problem. Just as Trump doesn't really know how to end the war, and frankly, I don't really know how to end the war. I mean, I have ideas, but will they satisfy each of the parties? That's always the condition. And the other point is, and it's one that we've talked about in the past, I think China has an interest in Putin's continuing the war. It doesn't say so explicitly, but by continuing the war, he is distracting America and Europe from China, and thereby enabling China to do whatever it wants to do in its own sphere of influence. Again, China would never say that, but I do think that's part of China's agenda, namely to keep Russia involved. And that also has the additional positive consequence of draining Russia's resources, of weakening Russia. And ideally, the ideal form of partnership for China with Russia is, of course, a weak Russia, one that is subordinate to China's interests, one that will do pretty much what China wants it to do. And at this point in time, Russia is significantly weaker than it was 3 years ago. And that brings me back to the point I made a few seconds ago, namely, if China wanted to end the war, it could pressure Putin tomorrow. Indeed, it could do that today. Instead, it's producing these, pretty much meaningless statements of intent about peace, love, brotherhood, sisterhood, and apple pie, and everything else that we like and hold dear.
Well, I agree with you 100%, Professor. Again, we don't know what will happen within the next following 2 weeks. Again, we hope that there's going to be a successful meeting among Trump, Putin, and Zelenskyy. And of course, this war not only created dialogues among the international friends and allies, but also it served as a reminder, continue help us to understand the devastation and the drawbacks of wars. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. He is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR. I strongly encourage everyone to go online to connect with Dr. Motyl. So, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the global affairs. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to your audience for listening and watching.